Good evening. Good evening. My name is Hamad Nasser. Welcome. Do please take a seat. We're going to make a start. I'm the Director of Programs and Content here at Ibraz, and it's a real pleasure to introduce an event that in classic Desi style we've been working on for some time. But it has finally arrived, and it's a real pleasure to welcome Hanif and Wahid here today. I'm not going to sort of make introductions to their work, because I think that's pretty redundant, because otherwise you wouldn't be here. But I do want to say a couple of words of thank you. Firstly, to Umar Robert Hamilton of the Palestine Festival of Literature, because I think it was last year when I saw a wonderful event that they'd organized with Wahid and Isabella Hamad, and that conversation sparkled. And I was like, well, that's the kind of event we should do here. So a few weeks after that, we had a conversation, and I'm thrilled to have that format of two writers talking about the worlds that they build together with us here. And what two writers we have. Both of them happen to have new books out, Mariam and Son for Wahid, and Rebel English Academy for Hanif. And while known Wahid for that short little time, we were just sort of reminding ourselves that we go back a few decades, Hanif and I, when he was an intrepid reporter in Newsline in Karachi. And we've seen the books that have followed, the journalism. Both of them were at the BBC, and of course that we were around the corner from the headquarters of the BBC. So we'll see the worlds that they have built, and with that, I'm going to hand over to Wahid and Hanif.
Thank you, Hamad. We have known each other for a very long time, and civilians, people who are not writers, they kind of tend to think that that these writer people, they're like a very closed, cliquish community. They just read each other's works and praise each other, and I think in our case, it is completely and absolutely true. Because we were both journalists, we met in a newsroom, and I don't know if you guys know this or not, but in old-style newsrooms, if somebody's reading a novel, you know that they're a suspect, that their heart is not in what they're supposed to be doing. Their loyalties lie somewhere else. So I saw him reading a novel in the newsroom, and I myself was a closeted writer. So I think at some point we started talking about books, and we came out to each other. And since then, we've been reading each other's works in progress, sometimes shaming each other, sometimes, sort of being positive. So that is our story. That's how we became friends, sitting in a sort of newsrooms are not especially book-friendly places. So that's how we got to know each other and started writing books. And that's what we've been doing since then. That was a long time ago. And now we both have new books out. Fourth, see, very loyal couple we've been. So, would you want to say something about your book and read?
25 years, as I like to think, it's a quarter century. I think it's too long, but
yes,
we can't seem to get rid of each other. Hanif, many years ago, I was a rookie journalist in India, in Delhi. And I was restless, as most journalists who have pretensions of being a writer or writing books. And I wanted to get out somehow. So Hanif was the person who recruited me, if you remember there was this was when Pakistanis were allowed to go to India on visas and travel to India, and they came from London, and I wanted to join the BBC, and Hanif was there, and incidentally another friend in that room also then wrote books. Sam, if you remember Sam Miller.
Yeah, we will get into the BBC gossip later, maybe, because later I realized that everybody was trying to write a book. Who was doing the BBC work? Thank you, thank you, license payers.
It was a bit of a. No, it's been very interesting because I quit journalism, everyday journalism many years ago. And Hanif has kind of been threatening to quit, but not really been able to do so. And he's stayed on top of both these things that we do. He writes books every few years, and then he also does these wonderful, wonderful multilingual columns for the BBC. Back to BBC again. And over the years, we have, as Hanif said, we've sort of sent each other, parts of books, entire books, books that haven't kind of been there yet. What do you think? And what do you think? And it's kind of been, it's been interesting because we both write fiction and we've been both journalists, but we also come from different places. We also write different books. Hanif, as you know, I read Exploding Mangoes, his debut in manuscript, when it was a draft many, many years ago. And Hanif read the very first draft of The Collaborator all those years ago. And I'm sure many of you writers, when you're doing your debut books, you're full of doubt and self-doubt, and you don't know whether what you've done or threatening to do, does it work? Is it any good? So at that time, it was kind of very, very precious and important validation to be, in touch with somebody who understood what you're doing, and that worked for probably, both of us. And in that, okay, it's not so bad. When I read Exploding Mangoes, which was a revelation for me because this was the first time I was reading a South Asian writer, and you kind of, you grow up reading the usual fare. I mean, you read Rushdie and Naipaul and all those people when you're in South Asia. But this was different. This was more like Latin American fiction. It was more like Yosa. There was a bit of Marquez there. So for me, it was quite a refreshing break as well to read Exploding Mangoes all those years ago. It was unlike anything I'd read in South Asian fiction. After all these years, as I said, Hanif has written 4 books, and I've done 4. And it so happens that we have these 2 novels that have come around at the same time. This is a really, really funny book, Rebel English Academy. It's what the children call, it's LOL funny in many places. And it's of course it's scathing, and it's brilliant, it's explosive. It does what, in many ways it goes back to the tone and style and the themes of his first book. Is that a correct kind of?
Yeah, I mean, you can sit here and praise me like for next 1 hour, and I'll be a very happy listener. But I thought we were going to talk a bit about Mariam and Son and read from it. I also read it in manuscript form, just for the sort of brief introduction. Like, those of you who are parents, their biggest terror is that if they are at a school run, if they are at an airport, if they are in a shopping mall, and they sort of turn around and the child is not there. Even if it's like for a few minutes, the kind of terror they feel we as parents feel. This book, for me, addresses that very, very basic human instinct. You want to read a bit from it and tell us a little bit more about it?
Why don't you read first?
Okay. I will. My book is starts at there was a famous hanging in Pakistan. So this starts on the night of the hanging. On the night of the hanging, everything is as calm and orderly as it should be in a jail devoted to the safety and care of one very important man. All prisoners but one are asleep in their cells, restless, dreaming of their victims or their loved ones, which in most cases are the same people. The Rawalpindi sky is clear and full of stars. All the talk about omens is rubbish. There are no meteor showers, no storms brewing on the horizon. The sky is not going to shed tears of blood. The earth is not about to split open and swallow its wretched inhabitants and their grief. The man who is awake has asked for a safety razor, claiming that he doesn't want to look like a mullah in death. After consultations with the superiors, the jail superintendent has sent for a barber who shaves the man gently, making sure to clear the fuzz from his earlobes. The man asks for a cigar, and the jail superintendent doesn't need to ask for his superior's permission. No man who is about to be hanged in 3 hours and 45 minutes has ever tried to kill himself with a Monte Cristo. The jailer makes sure to light it himself. The man chews on his cigar, takes 2 deep puffs, and regrets it, thinking maybe he should have quit when he had the time. The man asks for his Shalimar perfume, sprays himself, and lies down on the floor. A mosquito buzzes near his ear. On any other night, he might have called in the jailer and given him a dressing down for infesting his prison cell with poisonous insects, might have accused him of being a tool of the white elephant, his favorite invective for the United States of America. But tonight, he just shoos the mosquito away half-heartedly, listening to the rising and fading whir of its wings. He is grateful for the company. Everyone agrees on the above events. Those who wanted to hang him, those who wanted to save him, those who wanted a martyr in the early morning whose blood could help them bring about a revolution, even those who were indifferent. All agree up to this point that the man lay down on the floor, pulled a sheet over himself, and stayed still, dress rehearsing being dead. Although everything was still and orderly in and around the cell where an about-to-be-hanged man practiced his death pose, there was activity, quite a lot of activity around the country in some crucial spots. Many would later say, especially journalists and diplomats who made a living out of exaggerations, that it was the longest night of their lives, that they knew something historic, something catastrophic was about to happen. But only those who had been woken up without warning with a degree of rudeness would remember the night when their own time came. An imam was hauled up from his small room adjacent to his small mosque and ordered to get ready to lead the funeral prayers of a very important man. One of the world's sturdiest planes, a C-130, was on standby at Rawalpindi Air Base to ferry the body to the man's village. A military truck, followed by 6 machine-gun-mounted jeeps, made its way towards the airport, with some sleepy, some alert soldiers, their commander wondering why a dead man needed so much protection. Elite say elite, even in their death, he thought. Some soldiers sang a tea jingle, Chai chahiye, kaun si janab. Shut up, barked the commander. We are on VIP duty. A caretaker at the village graveyard was asked to start digging a grave. And when he asked what size, he was slapped. Your own size, he was told. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll read from Mariam and Son towards the beginning of the book. It's a novel set here in London, mostly, and small bits of it elsewhere in the Middle East, but mostly here in East London. Mariam Ali found her son missing on a Monday morning in early February. his bed empty, the duvet folded at the edge, 2 pairs of trainers tidy against the wall, some of his clothes, a red Nike t-shirt, a grey tracksuit hoodie and track bottoms, and his brown leather satchel hung from the door hooks. She breathed in sharply to smell, his breath, the lingering remnants of his deodorant, somehow reaching for and feeling his presence. She knew he had been in the room just hours ago. Outside, it was an overcast day, the persistent drizzle making the daylight dim and unfriendly. The air still bore the piercing sting of winter. The cold hush that descended on Holmcroft Street, on the outer edges of Walthamstow, didn't lift all day. Mariam's flat was one of the 8 in a pale brick block built in the 1990s. The morning's gauzy mist hadn't cleared yet, leaving blue folds pinned to the thresholds and doors of the ground floor flats. At the lower end of the street, Mariam's oldest friend and neighborhood shopkeeper, Tony, was absently running a ragged mop up and down his glass front with one hand, the other clutching his first rollie of the day. Closing her eyes as she stood in Dil's doorway, Mariam went back over the weekend, searching for anything unusual or untoward. Had she missed anything out of the ordinary? It had been a normal, uneventful weekend, like most they had. He had spent much of the day in his room on the computer, working or playing, she presumed, while she had gone grocery shopping, cooked 2 dishes, watched some TV, and done the laundry. As usual, she had waited for him to emerge in the evening so they could eat together, her only wish and demand of him. She had long given up asking him to get out more, spend fewer hours in front of the machine. A part of her secretly relieved he was home much of the time. She didn't have to wait for him to get home safe at night from trips out in the city with the boys. It had been soporific, predictable, like most weekends. Don't even think about it. I'm not putting Dil's poster on the park gate or the cafe. It's a small thing, Baji. Might help, you know. Every little helps. Okay, how about we do it? Zarro and I'll do it. You can stay home if you like. Not a chance. I'm not going to turn my son into a missing puppy or cat. I see these photos on the electricity poles, what do you call them, pylons, all the time. It's only been 2 days, he'll come back any time. What if he sees his poster on a wall or lying about on the street, his face on it? He'll flip. What am I going to tell him? What's there to tell, Baji? Zareen interrupted. Just the truth, innit? You went AWOL, dirty darling. You had us fucking worried, so we went a bit crazy looking for you. Simple. Language, I'm still here, you know? Come on, Baji, slips out sometimes. You do it all the time. You can't use F words in front of him. Anyway, I'm not making posters of Dilly. He's not a cat, he's not a puppy, that's my decision. The police have his photos. That man at the station seemed nice. They'll bring him home in a day or 2 if he doesn't turn up before then. Idiot, fucking idiot. Later that evening, as he sat down on the edge of his bed, gazing at the clothes hanging by the door, she suddenly felt deflated. The visit to the police station somehow felt unsatisfactory, not special enough. The officer had been matter-of-fact about it all, she thought. It ought to have felt momentous, more urgent and pressing. They should have shown more interest and keenness. It wasn't every day that her son disappeared, and although the officer, what was his name, was courteous, he had gone about the whole thing as if it happened every day. But maybe it does, she paused to think. Maybe it does. London is such a huge city after all. People must go missing all the time. Dil just one of them. This was the thought that deflated her, but soon after, it also brought a sudden sense of hope. If people go missing all the time, they must be found all the time. What else? Thank you.
Thank you for that. And sorry about that. It's a this one reminded me of your last book, which was also about a parent and child. Do you want to talk a little bit about?
We have a script, but we'll take a detour. I mean, not a lot. We did a few emails back and forth, and I know people are terrified of email chains, but it was a short one in terms of loose kind of, what do we talk about? Yes, the two novels, for reasons not entirely clear to me, are both about parents and their children. The novel before this one, called Tell Her Everything, was about a father and his daughter, who are estranged, and the father writes a long confession to tell her everything, what went wrong, or what all he's done in his life. He wants to come clean. He lives a very comfortable life in a very, very nice apartment overlooking the Thames. He's made lots of money. But the daughter isn't there. She's away in America, and he every evening he composes these letters in his head to his daughter. And in that format, he tells the story of what all he's done to get here. He lives in London. He spent time elsewhere. At the time we had our second child. My daughter was born around the time I was writing Tell Her Everything. And I wrote most of it in snatches because, new child in the house. At some point, it must have made me think about what do you become when you're a parent? What does it do to your view of the world, your view of yourself? What does it mean to be responsible for a life? And what do you think of your children? Because we all say that, you're a parent. Children become their own people, they're their own persons, they will become who they become. And a lot of it is not really correct, because we also want them to become something we kind of dream of. We have an image of them, in our heads. We tell ourselves, no, we will let them do what they want to do, which we do. But we also have an idea of who they might turn out to be, or who we want them to be. So I think I was kind of explore those things in that book, and probably similar themes in this book. But this was more pressing because it was more about, that one was about daughter and father, but this was more about the mother. This was more about, it's less about the child and more about the parent. When the child does something or is suspected of having done something, what does it do to the mother, to the parent figure, their own life? So this is about.
Yeah, I'm a bit curious about what goes on in your head. We kind of often talk and we meet about what you're working on, and you're living like, sort of basically a regular life, school runs and holidays and all those kinds of obsessions. So where do this idea, this really every parent's kind of nightmare ideas, where was the genesis for Mariam and Son? Like, how did you even go there? Basically, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, many years ago, in around 2016, if I remember correctly, or sometime before then, we used to have these stories in the media, in the press, about so-and-so person has gone off to Iraq or ISIS-held areas or anywhere, disappeared. And you had these headlines, so-and-so person has become, a thing. That's all we knew about those people, because that's what you were told. Very little about the person who's gone, and absolutely nothing about the person who's been left behind, which is the mother, the father, or the siblings. I think it was around that time I began to think of a woman in East London, a working-class British Muslim woman, of Indian/Pakistani extraction, as it's described in the press. And I wanted to stay then with the mother, not with I didn't want to do a radicalization story or how does this person do what he does or is suspected of doing. I wanted to stay with the mother and see what she kind of makes of her life after the act, you know, and who she is, you know, and she's, you know, a middle-aged person with her own desires and dreams, and she kind of is torn between being the responsible parent and the grief-torn parent of whose son has disappeared, but also someone who's like, okay, but I've got a life, you know, I still have a life, and that's when I kind of, you know, I think Mariam's kind of, you know, as I know people say that, you know, the voice didn't come, but I had a loose, vague idea of what she's going to be like and how she will talk. I think we need to go back to script.
Okay, now I have one more question, follow-up question to this, because Waheed has like a sort of very hardcore like fan base in Karachi, where he's visited, and I know I have like really close friends who say that Mirza Waheed's book is coming out. We want to buy the book. We want to buy a couple of boxes of tissues, and we are going to have a good cry for 2 days.
God.
And he's
Get a
never
life.
and he's never disappointed. And he's never disappointed. I mean, I'm kind of, you know, as a fellow writer, I'm envious of that, being able to give people that. Even when I was reading the manuscript, now I know him. And I know that he's, like, you know, struggling and he's writing, and this is a manuscript. None of this happened. Like, worst thing happens every day, and they don't make us cry. They don't make us do anything. But I'm like choking up reading when I know that Mirza has just made it up. So how is that done?
I mean, I do wish we could swap roles sometimes. I'm envious of your, you know, humor. Because your books make me laugh, and so many other people. So I wouldn't mind.
Collab, are you?
Collab.
Collab. Okay. No, I just want to know your process, because you're like not an East London mom. Like you're like, you know, sort of like how do you make them so real that we actually
Look, I mean, you know the tricks, and I think I do. The only thing I can say with some degree of certainty is I spend a lot of time with these people, and then I guess you're desperate because, you know, you spend so much time with these people. You're so. I spent 5 years with Mariam, and at some point you begin to know them in a way that, you know, you begin to feel this is how they're going to react and this is how they're going to behave and walk in a room. I like that idea of how they will spend time in a room. You know, how this mum is going to look at herself in the mirror. And she literally does this in the novel. She talks to herself in the mirror a lot. But that was my way of also looking at her. Okay, what does she see? And which gave me a chance to see her. And with loss and all those things, I suppose you do it, and then you have to you pare back. You don't want it all out there, you know. But mostly, you know, the process is such one of those questions. I walk a lot. I do a lot of thinking, as many writers do, about characters in the park. So there's these long walks, and I did lots of long walks because it was quite a stressful period as well. There's lots of things that happened in my personal life. So I was spending these hours and an hour and a half's walk in the neighborhood park every day for a long time, during which time I was only thinking of her and her child and her life and her late husband and her mum. I liked her mum's character later, you know, Amma. Enough about. I must now, you know, kind of this thing.
Yeah.
I really wanted to go back to the beginning because we, you know, as I said earlier, as Hanif said, we started our literary kind of adventures around the same time. I wanted to ask you, and this always intrigued me. So, you know, an origin story, if you like. What came before the Exploding Mangoes? What do you remember? What were you doing, or what was it that, you know, took you to Ali Shigri, I'm sure you remember, Baby O, Janal Zia, and the mango-eating crow, in that first novel. What exactly do you remember? What were you doing? How did it all?
As I sort of already said, we used to work in a newsroom together. And I think probably the immediate motivation must have been, do you remember those BBC guidelines, editorial guidelines book that we used to have like on our desks sometimes? So you had to kind of pretend that you live a life by some idea of like, sort of, fair and, sort of brie and human. And so we were doing that day after that, and it was kind of getting boring. I mean, you weren't boring, but like, generally the management meetings and all that stuff was quite boring. And before that, I was a beneficiary of a bad education. And some people, like you had a proper education. He was like my first literary friend who had read proper books. Before that, I didn't know anybody who read proper literature, could talk about it. So I had studied in the Air Force. You don't go to the Air Force to read literature, basically. So I just read on my own. But we used to have like these brilliant libraries, and libraries, like if you are in the armed forces, library is the most obvious place to hide because nobody's going to come looking for you, because nobody expects you to do it. So after that, I ended up in journalism and with the BBC. And so when you read too many books and like them, you have like this notion that maybe you can write one too, and then you find enablers in the newsroom. We say, okay, yeah, sure, there's no shame in it. We should be doing this. So I was just stumbling around, like, sort of thinking, like, what kind of novel, what kind of book I could write. So I'd had like pretty sort of dull, average life. I had like no personal kind of story to tell. But that was like my only like 7-8 years of my life that I had spent in the Air Force. So I knew kind of, how to fly a plane, how to crash it, and I'd done some journalism, so you knew like, how to finish a para, how to kind of, sort of turn the page, word count we'd learned. So I think all those things came together. Then that's how I kind of ended up writing that first book.
It was celebrated at the time, and still is, the debut of your debut. Were you nervous at the time how it was going to be received in Pakistan, or did you have any?
I have like lots of journalist friends, and they're like basically alarmists, as you know. I mean, that's like basic our trade. Like that's what we sell. Like, the world is going to end tonight, just after this event. And so I showed it to some of my friends in Pakistan, journalist friends, and they were like, "Have you gone crazy?" It's like, no. So the advice they gave was like, "Oh, why don't you change some names?" And then, but I didn't. I was nervous, yes, but I think my journalist friends, they were completely like wrong, as journalists usually are about these things. So nothing bad happened. Like sort of. Yeah, people read it, people laughed, people liked it.
So an important.
Can I ask you something about? We were talking about
follow-up question about I need to enforce some discipline. Across there's Exploding Mangoes, and then there's Alice Bhatti. There's Redbirds, and now Rebel English Academy. I've read Hanif's work, as is clear, all of it, and read closely enough, I like to think. Across all these novels, one of the recurring motifs is this encounter between two worlds, the military and the civilian. And it's dazzling and comic and tragic, and it's often brutal as well. I'm sure many of you recognize that. So, what keeps you pulling back to this territory? And how do you ever decide or think about how far to push?
Alice Bhatti was a totally civilian novel. Like
There's one figure.
army people. I think it must be since we emailed and since we kind of. So I not thought about this before. So I think it must be like that childhood, like sort of adolescence, like trauma. That when you're a man in uniform, right, and you're training so hard, working so hard, you wake up like before sunrise and you go to sleep, and then you are ready to give your life for your nation, country, whatever it is. I had no such plans, but that we all had to pretend to do that. And then when those people, whatever powers they might have, whatever medals they might have earned, and they still think that they're not getting enough love. So I think that has been my kind of abiding thing, that why. So sometimes I get misunderstood that I'm critiquing them, or I'm kind of writing something against the army, although I'm kind of basically invested in their most kind of fundamental kind of thing. Where is the love, baby? Why aren't you loving me enough? So I think that's why I keep going back to people in uniform, and I spend a lot of time in Pakistan. So they are like, sort of they crop up. I come from a small place called Ukada, and a few years ago I was there. There was like, there's a gymkhana, these posh clubs, which are like in big cities. And they say, oh, there's gymkhana, and gymkhana elections are happening. So I said, okay. So the election is being rigged. So I said, like, who is rigging the gymkhana election? They named a major. So you can't get away.
Yeah. In the real world, civilians hardly win. In the context of Pakistan or other such states, they hardly win against military, and that power. But in your fiction, they do, or sometimes at least they land, a blow or two. So this is now one of those literary questions. So what can fiction do in that space? Which reality can't allow. Because in the case of Pakistan, military always wins mostly.
I don't really know if fiction can do anything. It can just like, you can just poke somebody in the eye and run, and disappear for a bit, and for 5-7 years, and then sort of write another book. But now that we've done our part of the script,
There's more. Yeah.
so I'm very interested in this this question. That do you consider yourself like an immigrant, an exile, asylum person? Like, how would you? Because there is a literary question. It's not just a. Because your last two books are set in London, so I'm very curious at what point, how much time do you have to spend in a place where you can feel confident enough, let's say, or comfortable enough, that this is like, I can make this place my fictional home. If I want to describe, sort of a London police anti-terrorism guy, I can do it.
I'm never confident about these things. So you just make it up, but also I suppose you tell yourself, so this is the longest I've lived anywhere, apart from outside of Kashmir, where I was born and where I grew up. So at some point, I think you want to challenge yourself as well. That okay, you've been here for a long time. How about you set a story? And then I think you also want to you don't want to do a lot of research. It's a lot of work, So,
but this seemed like more research than any of your other books. And although it's a story about this loss and grief, and you're holding back and letting the sort of your readers do the grief work in this. But it's also a procedural. Like, what does the police do? Like when somebody goes missing, there's
So that was the part I had to read about, surveillance societies and what happens in this country or elsewhere. How do they operate, and what is, how do people talk? But after a while, you get bored with the research and so nobody wants to read what you read in your research. It's dull. And I think the only serious bit of prep work I did was I showed it to a police person. That was my only so concrete thing that does this sort of work, and he was like, "It's okay." So
not brilliant, but
no,
okay.
Yeah. So
72%.
Yeah, so that was
72%.
Good enough. But also, I was interested in that, because since you asked, I was interested in mechanism of surveillance in our age, in this age of information, and also I wanted to look at the nature of information, how our information is designed and packaged, and how it is presented to us. What does it mean? I wanted to, what does it mean when people say 72% or 82%, and what does it mean? I was also interested in the 20% more.
There's a brilliant line there as well in the novel. Yeah.
But it's an interesting question, because now I have, you asked when do you begin to describe yourself as an immigrant, and
So are you like a British Kashmiri writer or a Kashmiri British writer now?
Lately Kashmiri British writer.
Okay.
Because I can't go. I'm not allowed to go to Kashmir. So that kind of reconfigures in your writing mind, your usual mind, your human mind in ways that you haven't thought of before. And it also, who was it? Was it Flannery O'Connor who said something to the effect that if you lived until the age of 8, you have enough material to write for the rest of your life. So I'm kind of beginning to sense that I'm going to go back to my childhood a lot, and those years in Kashmir. So to come back to your question, so I have written these 2 novels, but I'm now already drifting backwards to where I was before I became an immigrant. Or
yes, since you mentioned that you can't go back to India, I don't know how much detail that you want to share with us. But it's kind of strange. Mostly people come here like seeking asylum, and then they become immigrants. And the reverse has happened. When you came here like as an immigrant, you got a job here, you came here, you moved here. And now it's turned into some kind of exile situation. Is it?
I don't dwell too much on it. I try not to, because it's kind of, this, I'm sure many of you read, Edward Said has this famous essay on exile, where he talks about what it does, and, the denial of dignity, basic dignity to people when they're not allowed to visit home, or to visit your kin. What does it mean? And then, obviously, it's a fantastic essay, and it goes into what do exilees do, how do they build a home away from home, what does it mean, it's really good. I've been rereading it a lot. And if one were to be so presumptuous to add something to it, I think it's a state of anxiety, a perennial anxiety. And maybe it's kind of, early days in the life of an exilee kind of state, where you're on a high alert all the time, because it's as if you've been put on notice, somehow, because your state is altered. So earlier you were like settled. You're an immigrant. You're British. You're Kashmiri. You describe yourself. I divide my time between London and Kashmir. London and Srinagar. One of those things. Oh, I live between New York and Lisbon. And all that is kind of, it disappears. But in a way that it kind of reconfigures, it reorients your thinking, your gaze, all the things you associate with writing, and writing as a person in London, writing about this place or that place. But yeah, I don't want to do a sob story about
we won't do the sob story. But you said earlier that you don't do much journalism now. The last piece that I remember is an excellent long essay. It was in The Guardian, right? About pellet guns. What did we used to call them?
Yeah, they were pellet guns. They were these buckshot
Can you,
weapons.
people might not have heard of them. Will you tell us a little bit about those? What was going on?
It was terrible. There were lots of people in Kashmir. This is a long time ago. Were blinded in Kashmir in about 2016. Hundreds of kids, they were blinded, and with this Victorian era gun called a buckshot gun. It's designed to hunt birds, prey. It sprays these things, in the air, which means to catch prey in flight. That was what it was designed for. They used this to crowd control, in those years. As a result of which, about 120 people in Kashmir, mostly teenagers, young people, were blinded, either completely or partially. So that was a very upsetting time, and I couldn't kind of get it out of my system. How does this happen? How do we arrive at this place in history, not just in regard to Kashmir, with regard to where we are in the world, that you're okay to deprive people of sight, vision, snatch their eyes. And they knew. It's not like it was an accidental thing, because you can blind somebody by accident, maybe one or two, not hundreds. So that was the genesis. I then decided to kind of do a little bit of research where all that had happened in the world, in history, in modern history, in Spain, in Palestine, back in the Byzantine era. It was one of the first instances of when you blind people. But that was a long time ago.
And now, sort of, I like, when middle-aged people talk, they kind of talk about, like, when in our time. So in our time, it just seems yesterday that you were like the young, hot Kashmiri writer, which you still are. But since then, there have been lots of fabulous books coming out of Kashmir, and I sometimes and you promote them. You kind of very. So I was just wondering if you've become like some kind of guru figure in this Kashmir literary circles, and tell us a little bit more about like what is being written.
You have blurbed every Pakistani book in the last 15 years. So, no, not really. That's the last thing you want to be. You don't want to be, and I don't want to be. I loathe the idea that you can tell somebody what to do. But because you remember that when you were writing and when you were starting to write, you had... there's a fantastic line by Hilary Mantel where she talks about giving a new writer courage. It's less about praise or teaching somebody, but that you give somebody courage that you can do. This is fine. You can do it. I think that's the only thing I believe in, because I had that when I was, my friends read my work when I was starting out. You read it, and a couple of other friends read it. I think I do feel that is something you can do. That if somebody has a short story collection or a novel or novella, and you make time to read it. The only thing I do seriously is I read all of them, as in I read the full thing. But as you know, it takes time, so people get restless and impatient, which I understand. But I don't get back until I have read something.
Yeah, and Hilary Mantel, you mentioned her. I mean, she said many other things also. I just finished one of her books where she says, not about writers, but some other people who are like feral crawlers who come out to suck on your wounds. So that also happens. There's like a common myth, which is again true, that everybody who's writing a novel basically is thinking am I going to get a movie deal out of this? Which is so not true, I'm telling you, which is like completely not true. But and he wasn't thinking of it at all. Somebody came along, not only, and many writers do get a movie deal, like, somebody comes along, gives them a bit of money and says, your book will be a movie one day. And 90% cases never happens. With his first book, The Collaborator, the movie has come out. We'll tell you where you can watch it. But I'm very curious that when you saw it for the first time, like the first edit, what did you feel?
I will park that question, I promise to come back to it. But I must go back to the question I had for you. It's two questions. When was the first time you knew you wanted to write books, as in fiction? The first ever time, like you said to yourself that I'm going to write a novel.
I don't think I wanted to, but when you're kind of young and stupid and in the army and, sort of you, like one of those bad nights, like, when you making life decisions, I think without thinking it, I might have just made an announcement to my friends that I'm going to write a novel. I had like no idea. And I didn't write one for like 20 years or something. So yeah.
But you spoke the lines. You spoke the lines.
I spoke the line. No, I remember what I said. I said, I'm going to write a novel in English, I'm going to write a play in Urdu, and I'm going to make a movie in Punjabi. It was like the only, like some army man, drunk on bad booze can make those kinds of claims. Otherwise, there's no reasonable person makes those life.
But you did write a movie as well.
I did write a movie.
You want to tell us a little more about the movie?
No, we'll talk about the movie that has just come out.
Yeah. Okay, the second part of the question.
We'll come to that.
We'll come to that. No, movie, it just happened, as you said. I was traveling at some point, and I got a phone call from somebody who had read my debut novel and said they want to make a movie. And I thought it was a joke because, who makes movies about grim, dark books set in Kashmir? And why would somebody want to make a film of it? And how do you film it? It was... And that person was persistent, and he ended up spending about 3-4 hours on the phone call with me. His name was Gopi Sait. He was a New York-based film producer. But then I think I checked with you and the other friend. I said, look, somebody wants to make a movie, and everybody said, look, are they going to give you money to buy the rights? Take the money. What do you want? So I said, okay, the procedure, whatever that process is, they buy rights, and I then forgot about it. But then they kept sending me these scripts. And I remember one of the scripts was by a man called Henry Miller. And I was like, okay. And it was a... Yeah. And he's back.
One last job.
And it was... I was intrigued because I wanted to see how does an American film writer make sense of a novel which is very, very specific to where I grew up, and it was a revelation because it was actually a good script, So, and I, for the first time, understood that it's very difficult to do screenwriting, and I knew I wouldn't be able to do it, because I thought it's just another form of writing, but it was very different, and. And then they sent me scripts over the years, and I kept picking faults with them, with the scripts. This is wrong, that's wrong, but they just kept at it. And then, I think a couple of 2 years ago, they sent me these photos of locations, and because I knew they're not going to be allowed to go to Kashmir, and nobody's going to allow them to shoot a movie in Kashmir. So they found a valley in Georgia, which was quite stunning. I thought that's, so this is the first time I believed that they're actually serious about it. But until then, I think I remember I used to tell you that I don't know. I mean, it's not going to be happening. So they went to this place. They found a valley in Georgia, and they, next thing I know is they had these actors and crew, and they sent me these things, and it looked pretty, good. But then I was nervous. What do they it's your firstborn. So what do they do with it? And it was not bad, the film. It's kind of a good adaptation in that. Oh, you can't hear me. Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah. But it's notoriously difficult to turn books into good movies, is what I have been told. And so I was nervous. How do they turn it? So they've actually made a good movie. It's quite affecting and moving. And I also learned of this, how do you turn the things you've written on paper to screen.
Yeah, and I saw it, like the sort of a preview, and it looked stunning. Because one thing that you should probably know about Kashmiris, if you know any Kashmiris, they would think that there's no place more beautiful on earth than Kashmir, and which is probably true. So I was like, where the hell are they going to find another Kashmir? Like, where are they going to, if it's an indie film, how are they going to show all those mountains and lakes? But it was really, really stunning. The acting was beautiful, and I think I might have ended up saying and offending him that it actually looks better than the book. Which you should never say to a writer, by the way. But can you tell them where can they watch it? And,
it's not here in the UK. It was in festivals here in the UK and elsewhere, but it's on Apple TV but sadly not yet in the UK, but in South Asia, in the Far East, in the Middle East, everywhere apart from the UK and the US, it's on Apple TV, and it should be on Apple TV or some other platform soon.
So if you're traveling, South Asia, Far East, you can sort of just go to Apple TV and watch it.
I had this question about we talked about this, distance and perspective. So you live here, for a period you went back.
You tempted me back here, didn't you?
For a period you went back to Karachi, which is that around the time you wrote Alice Bhatti?
Yeah, I wrote Alice Bhatti and Redbirds, both the books I wrote there. Yeah.
Okay. And now you've written English Rebel Academy here. Yeah. So
I mean, it started like when I was in Pakistan, but yeah.
Okay. So it's an interesting, issue about distance and perspective. So you're there, but you're not there. You've lived a long time here as well. And do people sometimes consider you a diaspora writer? And what does it mean to you? Because I know you lived here for a long, long time. And
yeah, but I also went back and lived there for a long, long time. So yeah. And you were here through this period when I went back, and he was kind of tempted. No, वापस आ जाए सब ठीक हो जाए. Yeah. So no, I'm kind of I think I'm basically what the white people say here is like I'm an opportunistic kind of economic immigrant. I was just come here when I need to, and I pay taxes here, and my government here, which is like they use that money to help enable to kind of burn babies in Gaza and God knows where else. And when I'm in Pakistan, I'm still paying taxes. And they use that money to sort of pick up, sometimes my fellow writers and journalists and lawyers and kind of torture them and keep them in jails for very long periods of time.
Can you talk about
the distance that the idea that we used to have that you go to some Western white country and where kind of you can look at things differently because there's more that you have distance. I don't they're at your throat every day. This state or that state.
And there's no escape.
So yeah, I'm.
You mentioned the state in Pakistan. It has historically picked up people, disappeared them, put them into dungeons. You name it, tortured and never come back. There is someone in prison right now in Pakistan on very flimsy charges, and he is, he has aspirations of being a writer and definitely a reader. Can you talk a little more about?
Yeah,
This man.
wrote about it also because, I mean, I think most of you are here because either you've read some books, or some of you are like aspiring writers, or some of you just like being around, sort of literary types. So there's this boy comes from a working class family, tops every exam, one of those annoyingly gifted people, and gets into top medical college in Pakistan. Halfway through his medical education, walks into a library, reads 4 books, and decides, oh, I am going to be this literary type person. Leaves medicine, does an MA in English, gets a, what's it called, Fulbright scholarship, studies for 1 year, comes back, starts to teach. Something happens in the class, somebody accuses him of that he's done something blasphemous or said something blasphemous. Now that was 13 years ago. And now no judge will hear his case. And people, if you mention, they say like, who? It's like some dude like us who's like, lit tragic, who thought that like, they can find and make a life by reading and writing books and by, sort of going to festivals and book talks. In fact, that's what he had done. He had arranged he'd invited a novelist in his class who said something, exactly what we're doing here, right? And that's what happened to him. And I'm sure somebody from your side got a bail yesterday, but still is not released.
No, not released. And so they have this system, which is a revolving door system. So you are given bail in one case, but then they find another case from a few years ago. And this is, but we must take Junaid Hafiz is the person who was in prison in Pakistan. Seemingly, no hope for now, although they have these dates for hearings that he might get a hearing, get a kind of judge to listen to, but it hasn't happened yet.
It hasn't happened in the last
13 years. And there's nothing, it's flimsiest of charges, he's done nothing. And he's a young man who's now spent more than a decade in prison.
So yeah, I mean, it's all very nice for us to kind of, write books and talk about them. And but what a privilege it is that people doing exactly the same things with exactly the same intentions have had to suffer this.
So we know the Kashmiri human rights activist Khurram Parvez. So he's been in prison for 4 years now, more than 4 years, and his children have grown up without seeing their father. All he's done all his life is research human rights. He's produced these thick documents, essentially. If you ask somebody, what does he do? That's all he's done all his life, nothing. So he's produced these, well-researched, documents about human rights in Kashmir. So they slapped some charges, anti-terror charges, sedition, and so on and so forth, and he's been in prison. So yesterday, one of the Delhi High Court gave him bail in one case, but there's another case, so he's in prison. And there's another person called Irfan Miraj, who's a young journalist whose child has also grown up without seeing him. All he's done is one of the. So this journalist Irfan Miraj, he was one of the first interviews I ever did in Kashmir was with him. He was a young, reporter at the time, and now he's in prison, and many others. So in that regard, the states are very, very similar, in how they operate.
And the one you described here, our own very sort of British state. We have only. So I want to ask you a couple of quick questions.
It's a question before. These 4 books. It's a very nice question.
Okay, thank you.
Do you have a favorite? Nice one.
But we started like that when we were working in the newsroom together. Were you writing your book on the job?
Never during a shift.
Only in lunch breaks.
Never during a shift, outside of it. But I think I remember. But there's one. This is the part I found fascinating about writing fiction. If something happens and something you think is kind of arresting and must be written. So I think I wrote a long section during a work trip in Karachi.
Okay.
And it was an email to myself.
Okay.
And it went in the book. That was my win. It didn't go to the trash.
Yeah, I know people kind of always talk about writing spaces that where they can work best. And from that time, I remember those long management meetings. So where you have like your notepad in front of you, and everybody, if you've been to those meetings, everybody, like somebody says something, especially the boss or somebody, and then everybody has to repeat the same thing but in different words. Use different adjectives. So I would like randomly pick up what people were saying and keep jotting them down, looking like very involved in the meeting. But I was like, would be thinking of like some other like plot line or some chapter in my book, and I'm kind of making those furious lists and notes. So those meetings were really helpful in our writing process.
About this book. Does it say it's over, or where does it mean? Oh, we have time. Yeah, we have time.
Okay.
Do you remember the time, the atmosphere, the neighborhood, and where you were, what you were doing, where your family was when Bhutto was hanged?
Yeah, I was. There is this. I was doing an exam, like when you have like an annual exam, like in class 6, I think I was. So there's this myth that parents have always kind of said that you just do this exam and then your life is going to be fine. And I was one of those aspirational students, like, you might have seen those annoying teachers' pets type, like, who were always second or third in the class, or, like, or sometimes first. So I wanted to do well, and we kind of, it was the last paper, we were doing the exam, and it seemed like, sort of the life will have like long holidays. When you've given your exam, the results aren't out, that's like the best period of your life, that nobody can ask you that you've done badly, and what are you going to do next. So I must have been in that frame of mind. You came out of the examination hall and everything was like shut, quiet. By that age, no fear, like, you're afraid of your parents or teachers or the dark or whatever. But I had never seen like public fear, like people on the streets, just basically scared. And the others very excited, like, oh, this has happened. And others very, very suspicious, said this couldn't have happened. So, yeah, I remember that day, yeah.
The book starts, as all good fiction must do. It doesn't. It's what happens after the hanging. Do I have? I have more.
Okay. What used to be my secret talent at BBC? That if it was an hour and a half long meeting, I could bring it down to an hour and 10 minutes. I was like, just agree with everything. Do your notes furiously with the determination that this is done. There's like no other repetition. What was your superpower?
Oh, I think I successfully managed not to become a broadcaster, which was a.
You came from. I have one question.
Which was a decade long.
He was the first person who came who was like from the new media. It's like we are ancient, so please indulge us for a bit. So he was the new media hire, and he did sort of start and ran like a fabulous Urdu website, which was very successful till he left. Was very successful. You must have heard this from all the uncles who kind of once had jobs. But in fact, I said it. I flexed it to somebody then that, oh, we run the best Urdu website in the world. And they said it's also the most expensive website in the world. So we weren't cheap, right? We weren't cheap. But you started your working life as a sort of new media before coming here and starting this. But you've increasingly stuck to this form, which is novel, which is very old and ancient and kind of almost redundant, people keep saying. What is it that appeals you about this form rather than being a TikTok star? I think you're very good.
Yeah, I think it's a bit late for. I don't have. I don't even have TikTok. Disease, because you mentioned earlier you spoke to your friends about you want to write this novel and a film and a play. In my, when you're young, you're pretentious, and in my first day of my literature degree, English literature, there was a wonderful teacher called Dr. Badri Raina, who's still alive and is fantastic. He was also very strict. He wanted to know if people in his class do really mean to study literature. Why are they here? So he went around this class and why are you here? Why are you studying literature? First day, he taught fiction, modern fiction. And I was in the back row. And by the time I was waiting, what do I say? What do I say when it comes to when it's my turn? People said they want to be TV presenters for some reason. And he said, okay, why are you here? Why do you want to study BA English honors? I said, I want to be a novelist. Yeah. And it was literally to kind of, just to survive the question somehow, So it was around that time I thought,
It's understandable when you're young and pretentious.
Yeah.
But to be middle-aged and still pretentious,
I know.
How do we deal with that?
I know. Because there is nothing, and to slip into Urdu, or kuch aata hi nahi hai. I wanted to ask about this. For me, it's an important question. Women in your fiction, for me, they leap off the page. Whether it's Alice or Sakina in this novel, or the mum in Redbirds, and they're obviously good moving depictions, but they do portray. This a deeply unequal society when as far as gender is concerned, and you get them right mostly. It's difficult to write women. For me, it's very hard. It's very hard. It's not an easy job to do in fiction. Can you talk about a little more about this? They're very alive on the page. They're funny. They're
Thank you. That sounds like a compliment.
It's a very big compliment.
Thank you.
It's very hard to write women.
It's I've struggled with it, especially with my second book. My first book had hardly any women in it, and I was a bit concerned about that. So I was talking to somebody in publishing. I said, "Oh, there are not very many books. So will women read it?" So he said, who told you that women are not interested in reading about men? That's what they do. Shouldn't work. And then I had my second book was about a nurse who's Christian, who's very young, which I'm not a young nurse, nor am I Christian. So I was really worried. So I would show it to my basically first readers. You have a circle of 2-3 close readers who read your manuscripts and they give you feedback. But I think I lucked out in the sense that when I started out in journalism, I had Ambaris here and they were my editors and Razia Bhatti was my editor. So whatever you wrote, a copy, that a woman editor read it. And if you were bullshitting, or if you were being your basic man, misogynistic kind of thing, you will be called out right there on the sentence that like, what does this even mean? Like, how can you even if as a man this is what you think, you this is not. So I think I've been lucky that way, that I've had like women editors, close readers, friends, who, and it is like, as men, we will get it completely wrong, and somebody will, somebody will read it and call out your bullshit. In fact, I have heard complaints that now we have to do even this now for you, and besides everything else. But it is helpful. It kind of works, because you will fuck up, and somebody tells you before it's in like it's in published thing. Somebody kind of
No, it's truly. I haven't.
Stops you before that. That is, you should be grateful if you can have like such help.
No, it's, I mean, I haven't come across many male writers who do women so well. So thank you. We've done very well on time.
Thank you. We have, yes.
Yeah. Do we want to have questions, or what do you want to do?
Yes, yeah.
Do you want to read something?
No. You?
No.
I think there's that wonderful passage. You can. Yeah, please.
If I it was early. If I find it. It's a very short passage, and I wanted to do it because of the time we live in. It's towards the middle of the book, where Mariam is talking to herself. And she says, shall I visit some graveyards in advance, or should I start composing letters of regret to future victims? Shall I write to other broken-hearted mothers? Or shall I just pray hard and harass Allah Mia, pray that Dili never kills anyone, nor that he's capable of harming even an insect? Hi Allah, please let it be that he hasn't hurt anybody. How do they know it's him though? Why should I believe them? Why should I believe anything the government people say? Didn't that Tony Blair say Saddam Hussein was going to drop the atom bomb on Birmingham or someplace? Her mind flew back in time to the year of the protests in London. So many people everywhere, all saying the same thing. They went to bloody Central too, but the government went ahead and dropped the bombs anyway. Benchod Blair. Maybe all this wouldn't have happened, she thought, not for the first time. But I'm not allowed to say that, am I? Going to be called Jihadi auntie in no time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for this brilliant conversation. I will now invite you to our Maktaba for the book signing part of this event. And I will invite you to give a round of applause for these brilliant contributions.